Judaism. I'm very glad that all of you are here this evening for our webinar, Thinking About Good and Evil with Rabbis Wayne Allen and Bruce Ginsburg. I just want to mention we have over 30 people on the call, over 60 people registered. We're very glad that all of you are with us this evening. Before we begin, I would like to thank our sponsors for the evening. Benefactors Rabbi Bruce Ginsburg in honor of Rabbi Jeffrey Miller, Rabbi Robert Pilavin in honor of Rabbi Wayne Allen and Rabbi Bruce Ginsburg, our supporter, Rabbi David Grundlin in memory of his father, Gidon ben Tzvi Vemina, and our friends Lillian Gradovsky in honor of Rabbi Bruce Ginsburg, David Last in recognition of scholarship, and Rabbi Marianne Novak. I'm going to be sending in the chat the list of our sponsors to everybody. Thank you to our sponsors very much. All right, we are going to get started. I also just want to mention before we begin that I'll be monitoring the chat for questions. So feel free to write any questions or any comments you have in the chat. I will hope to address them. All right, I'm glad camera's not working, but your ears are. Good, I'm glad to hear that. Okay, so let's introduce our speakers for the evening. Rabbi Wayne Allen was born and raised in New York City. He has blended a career of service to the Jewish community as an ordained rabbi with his academic pursuits. Rabbi Allen is recognized as an expert in both Jewish law and 18th century British moral philosophy. The 5 books he has written and those he has edited are distinguished by the inclusion of philosophical analysis and historical context, adding an extra dimension to the more traditional forms of responding to questions on Jewish practice. He has served as a faculty member at the American Jewish University, where he has taught Jewish law, at California State University, Long Beach, where he has taught the history of modern Jewish thought and Zionism, and at the University of Waterloo, where he taught Bible and theology after the Holocaust. He has been a guest lecturer at York University in Toronto and at the Pardes Institute in Jerusalem. Rabbi Allen has served as a scholar in residence at synagogues in St. Louis, Kingston, New Jersey, and Ottawa, and currently teaches at the Community Hebrew Academy of Toronto, where he serves as co-chair of the Rabbinics Department. Rabbi Bruce Ginsburg has been the spiritual leader of Congregation Sons of Israel in Woodmere, New York since 1991. I know we have a lot of people from Sons of Israel on the call this evening. Thank you for being here. As a founding vice president of the UTJ, he authored its original mission statement, chaired its first half dozen annual conferences, and wrote and directed 2 documentaries, In Praise of Tradition, which traces the group's origin, and a conversation with Rabbi David Weiss Halivni, which explores the thinker's views on a variety of contemporary subjects. He co-founded the organization's Institute of Traditional Judaism and became the founding co-chairman of Morashah, its rabbinic fellowship, before serving as UTJ's president from 2003 to 2008. In keeping with the format we have adopted for previous UTJ webinars, today's exchange between Rabbis Allen and Ginsburg is structured as a conversation rather than as an interview. So let me start with you, Rabbi Ginsburg. Having read Rabbi Allen's book, could you share with us some of your first impressions?
I would be happy to do so, and thank you, Rabbi Kalmakoff, for that introduction to this evening's session. As I do, let me mention that, of course, we find ourselves, at least on the East Coast of the United States, in the last hour of Yom Yerushalayim, Jerusalem Day. And very much as was the case a week and a half ago in Lag BaOmer, we find our joy tempered with sadness and tragedy. There's a mix of the bitter and the sweet. We wish that it were otherwise, but unfortunately, it only underscores the fact that today's topic that we're dealing with, the theological problem of evil, of a mixture of good and evil in this world, is something that's not only intellectually intriguing, at least to those that have zoomed in today, but unfortunately, as Inyane Diyoma, is very relevant to events in the world. May it soon be that we see the peace of Jerusalem and that all Jews throughout the world can live in peace with their fellow men. Regarding Rabbi Allen's book, in this regard, I can tell you, at least from my vantage point, there are no mixed feelings. I think it is an excellent volume that I would recommend to each and every one of you. Here's what it looks like. It's entitled Thinking About Good and Evil. The subtitle is Jewish Views from Antiquity to Modernity. And what Rabbi Allen does in this text is he takes a look at that most difficult theological problem. Why is it when we conceive of God as being one, all-powerful, all-knowing, all good, how can there be evil in the world under such a circumstance? And thinkers throughout the world and through all time have been scratching their heads to come up with answers. What he does is he takes a look at Jewish thinkers throughout the ages, crossing the millennia, who have struggled with this problem, and he offers us their answers. It's more than that. He gives us a survey, but he divides it in such a way that we can run through Jewish time and some of the greatest minds and hearts and souls of the Jewish people in order to deal with these issues ourselves. He takes a look at it in the biblical period, followed by the rabbinic period, then among the medieval philosophers, the mystics, the Hasidic masters, then to our own time, starting with the early moderns, and then culminating with one of the most difficult aspects of this problem, the special quality of the Shoah, the Holocaust, and what that means to all of us. Now, just so you can understand why I think this is such a wonderful text, is that it is built beautifully. There's a structure to it. In each one of the chapters that I just enumerated, he offers us an introduction, then he gives us the substance of the arguments, and then he gives us a quick summary. You can see the academician blending with the pulpit rabbi, which he was for decades. He tells you what he's about to tell you, he tells you, and then he tells you what he's just told you. And understand, when he writes, that doesn't seem at all redundant. You'll thank him for it, because you feel that he's walking you through some complex texts and ideas, and you feel that you're learning. And each time he comes to the end of the chapter, he already prepares you for the next chapter. Basically, if you imagine a relay race, it's like handing off the baton from one era to the next, how one seems to precede the next and anticipate it. In addition to that, he takes a look at each of the thinkers and gives us a little bit of a biography on him or her, so that we understand their place in the context of their time. So you get to know the thinkers as well. So you should understand it's built beautifully, but not just that. Dealing with philosophy, dealing with theology, you could think that this is a very heavy book. Well, Rabbi Allen has a very light touch. He's got a wonderful style. You understand him, he's clear, he's informative, and he's got great turns of phrase. So I wouldn't want to say that it's entertaining to read, but it certainly keeps your attention. And by the time you come to the end of this volume, you will feel something that you often don't feel regarding many books, and that is that you've accomplished something. Because even though you may not get a singular answer or even a combination of answers that will satisfy you that now you understand why there's evil in a world with a God who's all good, powerful, and knowledgeable, you'll get a sense that you've really walked through history and seen the way great minds and shamot, souls, have struggled with this question. And then he does something else that a great teacher does. Toward the very end, he encapsulates the whole by giving you a list of some 35 different approaches to the problem of good and evil, and then a list of 21 where he personalizes it and says, these are reasons that have been suggested why individuals, you, God forbid, but you might have suffered. So by the time you get to the end of this book, you really feel that you know something. I'll share something with you, and that's the following. When I heard that Rabbi Allen was coming out with a new book, and it's a brand new book published this year, I assumed that it would be a book on Jewish law. Why did I assume that? I've known him for many, many years. I've known him for better than 40 years. He was a few years ahead of me in rabbinical school, and I remember as a rabbinical student, he was already recognized as so gifted that when the late Rabbi Isaac Klein was putting together his book, A Guide to Jewish Religious Practice, there were 2 rabbinical students who were selected to go through his manuscript and make sure that it was clean. One of those students was Rabbi Allen, And of him, Rabbi Klein said, he went through the manuscript with a fine comb, checking the references, correcting errors, and making many suggestions for the improvement of the work. This book became a modern-day classic in circles of people who care about Jewish law. Back in the 1970s, Rabbi Allen was involved in that. Then in the 1980s, when the Union for Traditional Judaism was founded, one of the earliest projects was our panel of halachic inquiry. Rabbi Allen, a very young man at the time, was selected to be among the members of that panel. But not only that, he was asked to be the editor of the first volume called Tomech Kahalacha. I want you to know this is now a collector's item. And you can see on the flyleaf, there is Rabbi Allen's name as the editor of this text. That's the 1980s. We come to the 1990s. I learned that Rabbi Allen is putting together Shelot and Tshuvot that he was receiving from people in his congregation, and it was possible to subscribe, to get them in the mail. Do you see this huge loose leaf binder that I've got? Well, in this binder, I've got the collection of the Shelot and Tshuvot he was putting together during that period of time that I've referred to often, and that eventually turned into another one of Rabbi Allen's books. For all of these reasons, I assumed when I heard that Rabbi Allen was coming out with a new volume, it would be more Shelot and Tshuvot. Instead, it is a book on Jewish thought and belief. And so I turn to you, Rabbi Allen, and I ask you the question: how is it that you came upon this particular subject and decided to explore it for all of us?
Be happy to address that question, Rabbi Ginsburg, but I must just make this preliminary remark. My mother, Aleha HaShalom, must be looking down with supreme pride and joy in hearing your words, and I hope I am deserving of all of that praise. Anyone who sits in synagogue and listens to Torah reading over the annual cycle is probably struck by one of the singular moments in the early Abrahamic saga, and that is prior to the destruction of the cities of evil, Sodom and Amorah, that God, according to the narrative, says, how can I withhold this information from Abraham? And God proceeds to tell of his plans. And in the course of the dialogue, Abraham says, Hashofet kol haaretz lo ya'aseh mishpat. How is it possible that a God of the entire universe would act unfairly? How is it possible that innocents who might be in these cities of evil might be subsumed in the destruction of all the other wicked? And I think we're struck by the initial expectation from the perspective of the Jew in the pew. What we're hearing is that we expect God to be fair and just, that the world that God designs operates according to principles of fairness. And yet, by observation, we note that that is not the case. So we have these defeated expectations, which leads to a host of questions. And many of them arise in the Bible. It's impossible to read the book of Job without being sensitive to the ultimate question of why is it that a good person might suffer? So just by being part of the what we would call the annual Torah reading cycle and the study that we as Jews may do, we're already very much aware of the question. As a pulpit rabbi, I had to address on more than one occasion the issue of where is God? Whether it was parents who had to watch a newborn baby go into sudden decline and early death, unfortunately, and wanted an answer to the question of why our child. Holocaust survivors who would ask me, why is it that I went through all this? True, I survived, but why didn't my family? Where was God? When I first came to Canada, I had two very heartbreaking cases in front of me. One was a 33-year-old newlywed who on his honeymoon went with his wife to Jamaica, and he took a stroll on the beach and he was murdered on the beach, gunned down. They never caught the perpetrator. And of course, the family wanted to know, how is that possible? Where is the justice in that? A 43-year-old was going through stage 4 cancer. And of course, he had his family very supportive, but two young children, one age 10 and the other age 8, who asked me as the rabbi to explain to them, because they understood what was going to happen, why God had given their father this terrible disease. A 19-year-old was killed in an auto accident during a fraternity initiation. And the family members wanted an explanation. And of course, as much as we try to offer an explanation, and sometimes we avoid offering an explanation, for there is no explanation that any rabbi who is in the field can imagine that would possibly satisfy, we begin to internalize that question. How is it that these events take place in the world? And as an academic, while teaching in the university, both at California State University, where I taught a course in modern Jewish thought, where addressing the issues raised by the Holocaust come to the foreground, and similarly teaching at the American Jewish University and also at the University of Waterloo, have to explain the theological issues that arise from the conflict that we have with reality. The problem that many rabbis, including my own confrontation would be, is that we want to be loyal. As traditional Jews, we feel that we ought to be loyal, we want to be loyal, and yet our experience creates dissonance. It is seditious, we believe, to complain that God is unfair, but reality teaches us that perhaps there's room for that admission. Rabbi Ginsburg, you've been a rabbi in the pulpit for many, many years yourself. Do you share that experience?
Much of the experience that you just described is experience that I've had in parallel. Of course, each and every individual situation is unique, and you described a number of them in your own experience. Clearly, no congregational rabbi goes through life unscathed with these kinds of issues. So I have seen situations where, unfortunately, parents have lost children under horrific situations, and young children have lost their parents. But I will share the following with you, and that is that I think in coming into contact with such cases, more often than not, the sharpness of the question has arisen in my mind even more than it has arisen in those of my congregants. Usually, what I'll hear from congregants, interestingly enough, is, Rabbi, I know that there are no answers. I'm not expecting you to give me answers to these.
Well, my experience has been, when it comes to personal loss and challenge, most of the people I've come across have not asked about the problem of evil. When it does come to the question of the Holocaust, standing at a bit of a remove in terms of the years. Many people didn't have a relative that they lost in the Shoah. Nonetheless, given its magnitude and the radical cruelty on display there, the massive impact on the Jewish people, that's when I seem to hear the question, how could this happen if there's a God who is Shomer Yisrael, is a guardian of the Jewish people. I know in your book, you provide us with an overview of some of the theodicies that have emerged in dealing with this problem. Could you please share those with us?
Of course. The Holocaust is a singular problem, and as such, it deserves a great deal of emphasis. And so, if you were to just take a look at the table of contents in my book, you would notice that the section on the Shoah constitutes the single largest section. And I referred to it as the singular problem of the Shoah. My investigation and my studies over the course of the years has led me to do a bit of categorization. Perhaps it's a little bit of the Aristotelian in me. Aristotle loved to create categories. So did Rambam. So I feel that I'm in good company when I try to organize all of the different theodicies relating to the Shoah into three. And I label them the theological traditionalists, those who want to maintain, as the Talmud teaches, that there is no death without sin and there is no suffering without wrongdoing. So in that case, it is the job of the theologian to explore and examine and identify what is the sin. And once we identify that, then we know how to behave. Incidentally, I submitted an op-ed piece to the New York Times, which they did not print, but it was, what is Judaism's response to the pandemic? And what is most interesting to me is that I have discovered that there are many Roshei Yeshiva and many rabbis around the world who take this approach, that COVID is actually punishment from God for a particular sin. And it's the sin perhaps of failure to observe proper tzniut. That's one reason. Another is because of assimilation and intermarriage. And this is perfectly within the framework of the theological traditionalists. Find the sin and identify it. In terms of the Shoah, there were those who saw the sin as Zionism, or they saw the sin as assimilation. And I explore, evaluate, and assess these opinions in my book. I'm not going to take the time now to criticize them. There was a second category of theodicies in the Shoah, which I identify as the Radical Revisionists. The Radical Revisionists. These are those scholars who say, as a result of the scope and magnitude of the Shoah, an evil so radical that it upsets any theodicy, there is no justification, and therefore we reject the idea of God altogether. And included in this group would be thinkers like Richard Rubinstein. I have to tell you, my own personal experience, I think it was in my second year of study at the Jewish Theological Seminary of America, that Richard Rubinstein was invited to come and speak to the student body, which is very interesting to me. And having read his writings, I was very curious and I thought I would attend, but as it happened, my schedule wouldn't permit it. But what was interesting is that no one appeared. He was invited to speak and not a single person came, because the popular belief at the time is that Rubinstein rejected God altogether. In fact, you read my book, you will see that he does not. But that was the feeling, but that he does represent a strain of thought that says we cannot accept a traditional version of God any longer. And then, of course, we have a category that I call deflectors. The deflectors are those who say, yes, we can't explain evil. Yes, the evil was terrible. Suffering was great. But let's not lose track of other questions, larger questions that have to be resolved. So this is a kind of deflection. So the question would be something like, Will Herberg says that God didn't put any Jews in gas chambers, Nazis did. And to ask the question, where was God, unfairly shifts the blame from Nazis and their assistants, whereas Goldhagen calls them Hitler's willing executioners. And it shifts the blame. And by doing so, we are actually letting the Nazis and their henchmen off the hook. And then there were thinkers like Emil Fackenheim, who for many years taught at the University of Toronto before he made Aliyah to Israel, who's often quoted as having posited the 614th commandment. He never framed it this way, but that's how people assign it to him. Thou shalt not grant Hitler posthumous victories. Yes, we can't explain this evil, but if we packed up our tents and said we can no longer believe in the traditional Jewish God and that's it, then we are ceding to Hitler exactly what his intentions were, and that is to eliminate Jews. And finally, you would have someone like Elie Wiesel, who admits that after the Shoah, we cannot, we have great questions. It's hard to live with God after the Shoah, he says, but it's impossible to live without him. So these are the deflectors, and each of these areas I discuss at length. I'll just add as an aside, because Rabbi Ginsburg, I think you might want to draw a conclusion based on this, is that our revered teacher, and you of course did the documentary, Rabbi David Weiss Halivni, is also in my book, and he has something to say about the Shoah as well. So what I would say is, where do you think you, Rabbi Ginsburg, as a leader of the UTJ, a founder of the UTJ and Morasha, where would you situate yourself and your colleagues in the UTJ along the spectrum that I've just outlined?
I can hardly speak for all of my colleagues, of course. Let me first put an asterisk on something that you just said and something that I just recently read in Commentary magazine. You indicated that Emil Fackenheim himself didn't refer to the 614th mitzvah. It just so happens, I learned, that article appeared in Commentary magazine, was edited by Norman Podhoretz, who is the one that coined that particular phrase. So, for people who are both authors and editors, as you've been, Rabbi Allen, you deserve full credit for both. We don't often see the hand of the editor behind that. Regarding the UTJ and ITJ and our thinking, interestingly enough, in your book, you make reference to 3 individuals who have had close associations with us. One is Elie Wiesel that you just mentioned. We actually had a particular dinner that we held in his honor and that of his lifelong friend, Rabbi David Weiss Halivni, going back a good number of years ago. And he served on our academic advisory committee of the ITJ, the Institute of Traditional Judaism, as did another thinker that you mentioned, Eliezer Berkovitz. One you describe as a deflector, another one you describe in the traditionalist camp, even though he's not quite the same as the other traditionalists you mentioned. But I would identify most closely with the one you just mentioned, and was a founder of the Union for Traditional Judaism, and to this day is our spiritual mentor, and that is Rabbi David Weiss Halivni. It just so happens, as I was thinking about this just yesterday, Rabbi Allen, I noticed that it's not as though you ever categorized him in any of those 3. You treat his thinking within the traditionalist category, sort of rubbing against the idea that a sin was committed, and that's the reason that the Holocaust occurred. But you never outright define him as a traditionalist, or certainly revisionist, or a deflector. As I was taking a look at his book, which is called The Book and the Sword, I came up with another term that perhaps you might want to adopt in a future volume of yours, Rabbi Allen. And it seems to me that Rabbi David Weiss Halivni is a synthesizer. He's one that believes that you can hold two poles at the very same time. After all, the Sisma, the motto he created for the Union for Traditional Judaism and the Institute of Traditional Judaism is Emunat Srufa v'yosher da'at, genuine faith and intellectual honesty. He actually believes that these two things that could look like polar opposites to some are really different elements that reinforce each other. In that regard, as I took a look at the book, I discovered that he created a midrash. I'm going to simply read his midrash to share it with everybody. This is the sort of thing that could take an entire hour just to delve into it and decode it. But listen to his midrash on the Shoah that reflects, I believe, his synthesizing view. When the sound of the closing of the door after the first child was shoved into the crematorium reached heaven, Michael, the most beneficent of angels, could not contain himself and angrily approached God. Michael asked, "Do you now pour out your wrath upon children? In the past, children were indirectly caught up in the slaughter. This time, they are the chief target of destruction. Have pity on the little ones, O Lord." God, piqued by Michael's insolence, shouted back at him, "I am the Lord of the universe. If you are displeased with the way I conduct the world, I will return it to void and null." Hearing these words, Michael knew that there was to be no reversal. He had heard these words once before in connection with the 10 martyrs. He knew their effect. He went back to his place, ashen and dejected, but could not resist looking back sheepishly at God, and saw a huge tear rolling down his face, destined for the legendary cup which collects tears and which, when full, will bring the redemption of the world. Alas, to Michael's horror, instead of entering the cup, the tear hit its rim, most of it spilling on the ground, and the fire of the crematorium continued to burn. That's this fascinating midrash that I believe holds on to two poles, just in terms of the slightest emphasis on that. On the one hand, he says there was precedent for the Shoah, the 10 martyrs. On the other hand, he says, but it was unique. This was genocide. On the one hand, we see the depiction of God as a chief executive and short-tempered at that. On the other side, we get a real glance of the essence of God being compassionate and his tear rolling off his face. And then we get that incredible twist that the tear hits the rim of the cup with only part of it going in and most of it falling out. This raises as many questions as it answers, but I think it does give us the sense of Professor David Weiss Halivni, who is a synthesizer, can hold two ends at the same time and say there is a truth that reinforces each other. I take inspiration from that. And I also take inspiration from the concluding chapter of your book, Rabbi Allen. I believe that you provide us with a certain chidush there. If you would share some of your conclusions from your book.
Yes. Interesting, in my conversation with the editors at JPS, they said, "Oh, your book's wonderful, fine, every chapter a gem, lovely, but you need a conclusion." And I said, "I don't know that there is a conclusion because we leave it, as the rabbis say in Teiku, there is no definitive answer here." They said, no, you still need to have a conclusion. You gave us a guided tour of all of the sources from the beginning until through the Shoah, but you have to provide something as a conclusion. So I thought about it, and looking at the way theodicies are constructed, I suggest a pathway. It's a pathway that I have not explored. Perhaps one day I will, perhaps someone else will. And it's based on the fundamental principles, the premises that make up the entire question of theodicy. We start off with a principle, as you mentioned, Rabbi Ginsburg, that God is all powerful, along with the fact that God is all good. And we also have to say that evil is real, unlike other Eastern religions that say that evil is an illusion. We do say that evil is real, but there's one other element that has to be included, and that is that God is all-knowing. And this is important because there is always in every legal system a reduced layer or level of liability for those who don't know. If you say, I didn't know, that wasn't my intent, or I had no knowledge of it, then you are not entirely liable. The possibility remains that God is indeed all powerful, so he has the power to defeat evil. We can say that God is all good, and therefore he wants to defeat evil. But perhaps God is not omniscient in the sense that we take it, that he knows everything, but he has extra knowledge. He has superior knowledge. There's actually a term, I'm not going to disturb everyone here on this call with this specific term that I cite, but maybe he doesn't have total knowledge. In that case, maybe he wasn't aware. In that case, then we have a justification by retaining the notion that God is all good and that God is all powerful, but not necessarily all knowing. And of course, there is a biblical justification for that. And that is where God says, Erdana ve'ereh, let me go down and see what's going on in stone. I hear some things that are not too good about this world, but I'm not aware of it directly. I better explore. Perhaps this is an indication by the Torah that God's knowledge is not exactly as what the medievalists would claim. And perhaps this is something worth exploring, although I have my doubts that it would be successful. Rabbi Kalmankov, I think perhaps we should be able to take some questions at this point.
Yes. All right, I'm just monitoring the chat, and I see here Mitch Morrison had asked a little while ago. There's been a proliferation of views expressed regarding the tragedy on Lag BaOmer at Meron, and some decline to look at the human responsibility and waive it as the Yad Hashem, the hand of God, and that our only recourse is to do teshuvah, to repent, and to intensify our observance of certain mitzvahs. So he wants to ask you, Rabbi Allen, from your analysis of the sources, what should be our approach in our assessment of human responsibility in any divine involvement?
Okay, so this is not the first instance in which we've had a variety of rabbis come up with some interesting, often disturbing answers to what happens when we confront tragedy. If you recall, this is going back to the 1980s, I believe. For some of us, it's like yesterday. But if you remember, there was a school bus filled with children in Israel that was hit by a train. And in reaction to this tragedy, when there were unfortunately many deaths, one of the rabbis, I'm not going to mention the name, at that time suggested that the reason why these children died was because they checked the mezuzot in the homes of these girls, and they found that the mezuzot were deficient. Had they bothered to check the mezuzot, the tragedy would have been averted. Remarkable kind of expression, but this is the length and the extent that authorities will go in order to justify what can otherwise be considered a challenge to God's fairness. Now, with regard to Rabbi Morrison's question in particular, how should we respond to the tragedy at Meron? I would refer to Rambam. Rambam, in his guide, suggests that there are three different kinds of evil. There is what he terms moral evil. That's the evil that is done one person to another, murder, theft, rape. These are moral evils. There's natural evil, earthquakes, tsunamis, disease. And then there's an area that he identifies as personal evil. These are disasters that we create, unfortunately, by our own efforts. A person perhaps who, we all know the dangers of drug abuse or smoking, and yet there's still people who continue to do that. I am constantly amazed still that there are Jews, observant Jews in the Jewish community who continue to smoke. I can't understand it. I certainly don't justify it. So one approach that Rambam offers us is that we have to ask ourselves the question of how are we in terms of accepting liability or responsibility for events that happen? Was there sufficient planning? So it's not a question of where was God in this tragedy. The question was how, as human beings, the government of the state of Israel, the local municipality, the police forces, how should they have improved or anticipated some of the problems? From my reading of the events of the case, much of the potential for tragedy was already identified, and yet there was inaction on that part, and unfortunately, the responsibility has to be taken personally rather than blame assessed outward. So I want to be clear here. I'm not pointing a finger and I'm not blaming the victims. But what I am saying is that often we confuse theology with human responsibility, and they are not the same. If you build your house on the San Andreas Fault and then complain to God when an earthquake strikes, that is an abuse of theology. That is not the correct question to ask. The proper question to have asked is, why did I build my house here? So I'm going to stop here because I think there may be others who want to respond or ask a question.
I'm just going to ask two more questions that came up in the chat. One
Okay.
question was, why do we say that the Crusades, why do we say that the Holocaust was worse than the Crusades? Was one question. Another question.
Let me just deal with that. And,
okay, sure.
In the opening section of my chapter on the Shoah, in which I deal with, first of all, what are the names? What's the appropriate name for this episode in human history? I deal with all of the questions that have come up is the uniqueness of the Shoah. Remember, you heard me say I call it a singular event. It's certainly not unique in the sense that there were no other tragedies or no other great tragedies. However, what makes it qualitatively different and why it's different than the Crusades is the fact that the Holocaust was, first of all, decided upon by a government who made it its official policy and then assessed all of the resources necessary for carrying out its mission. It was organized, government sponsored, and intended to eradicate an entire group of people. The Crusades were random. The mobs that during the course of the Crusades attacked various villages in the Rhineland was perhaps incited by Pope Urban, but it was not directed by the Catholic Church, or it's certainly not by any of the local authorities. And in more cases than not, it was a popular mob attack. And it wasn't intended to annihilate an entire people. The Crusades' intent was not to commit genocide. The intent of the Crusades albeit that it degenerated, was to recover the Holy Land from the infidels. For those who were unable to make it to the Holy Land, then the alternative was attack the infidels that are nearby, namely Jews, because there were no Muslims in the Rhineland. So that makes it qualitatively different than the Shoah. So that's the answer to that question. I say more about it, but you can find it in the book. Second question.
The last question that we're going to ask for the evening is confronting evil and enduring suffering humanity's challenge to become more empathetic and compassionate, less judgmental, and more humble in this life?
I'm sorry, I don't understand the question.
So I will let the person who asked the question unmute themselves then.
Okay.
And, oops, sorry. You're muted, Professor.
Oh, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes, I can.
Yeah, it just the thought that perhaps we are limited and we cannot fully understand, just as we cannot comprehend the extent and the pain of the Holocaust and why it happened. The way out of this conundrum is to rededicate ourselves and our commitment to the better angels while we're here for the limited time that we have on earth, to be more vigilant, to be more involved, to be more compassionate, and let whatever waits for us in the afterlife take care of itself. The other aspect, as a survivor of the Holocaust, I was always wondering why my parents never spoke about it, and they suppressed it. And only in my adult life was I able to uncover and delve into the subject. I wonder whether that is a pain that is unbearable to older survivors of the Holocaust, that I don't know that how to deal, and we may make litter of the sacrifice that they made, some survivors made, in not speaking about it and not developing the thought that there should be some retribution, some accounting, some. The only thing that I recall very distinctly, we came to America when I was 12 years old, was that there were offers by the German government to compensate my parents, and through their life, they refused. Mm-hmm. And yet, years ago, I received stipends from the claims conference, and not knowing originally why I was getting this sum of money, and periodically ever since it has been coming to me, only to be told that this is they are now going to the second tier of sufferers. The fact that we were hiding in the mountains, that was suffering enough for me to receive some form of compensation. So there's so many thoughts to.
So I think you need to read the book.
Yes.
That's my suggestion. Okay, my friend.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for your comments. I appreciate it. For the sake of time, I'm going to close the program here. Rabbi Allen, would you like to close with any last thoughts?
My hope is that in writing this book, all those who read it, but particularly a Jewish audience, will come to a fundamental realization that while the problem may be insoluble, it raises an important objective of Jewish life. And I'm going to identify that. It tells us that we as Jews expect that the world should be just and fair, and when it fails to meet our expectations, we complain. Reminds me of the story of the waiter who comes to the table where Jewish diners are eating in a kosher restaurant, and the waiter, the server asks those who were seated there, is anything okay with your meal? And that is because we as Jews complain, and complaining is good because it means we expect the world to be better. When we raise the question of evil in the world, it's because we want a world where evil doesn't exist. And what we can do to move the world closer to that ideal, what we can do in order to bring about that time, is our objective. So while theology shapes the entire work, it is this hope that drives it to its conclusion.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Rabbis Allen and Ginsburg, for this wonderful conversation. And thank you to all of you for being here this evening. Also, just want to thank our sponsors one more time. I'm going to be sending their names in the chat. And before we end, I just want to mention that the UTJ, Unit for Traditional Judaism, we have a few upcoming events. I'm going to share the link to those upcoming events in the chat. Feel free to register. We have one event coming up with Dr. Karen Kirschenbaum, who will be speaking about the Grush, Rabbi Dr. Shaul Lieberman. We also have a three-part series coming up with Rabbi Dr. Ari Bergman about the history of the Talmud, the historical development. So go to that link that I just sent in the chat to register for those two events. Thank you again to all of you for being here. Stay safe. Be well. Thank you. Laila Tov.
Laila Tov.
Bye-bye.